Now, tonight I have entitled the lecture that I'm about to give, The End of the Medieval Church Age. The End of the Medieval Church Age. And I want to explain the title first, okay? When we talk about the medieval church, we're talking about the period of time from roughly 470 or so to the beginning of the 16th century. So we're talking about 1,000 years of time, from roughly 500 AD to roughly 1500 AD. This is the Middle Ages. The middle because it's the middle of the church age, the 2,000 years, the 1,000 years in the middle is the middle. But it's also the Middle Ages because it's between the time of the imperial and early church at the beginning and then the Reformed and modern church at the end. 500 years on each side of that. And so it's the middle of that particular period of time. So we're talking about the medieval period coming to an end now as we approach the 16th century in our series here. The 13th century, the beginning of the 1200s through into the early 1300s, is the high point of medieval civilization. It's the high level. The papacy is at its zenith in terms of the popes in Rome having power. It's the mendicant orders I talked about last week, these men who took vows of poverty and then went out with the gospel into the world to proclaim it. They're at the zenith of their power, bringing the gospel out to the world. The universities have been established and they are developing impressive theological thinking. We talked last time about the scholastic works of Aquinas and others like him who began to think about Christianity, not so much in terms of blind faith, but in terms of a rational faith, of understanding and how it applies to Christian thought. Now, I want to explain that although the medieval period is coming to an end in our discussion, the Church of the West that exists will continue to today. Okay, it's not really going to be much different. With the exception of a few new additional dogmas that will be added in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the Marian dogmas having to do with the Assumption of Mary and her Immaculate Conception, Roman Catholicism is pretty much in place by this point and continues unabated to today. So the Church of Rome that we see today is really nothing significantly different than the church that you see at the end of this particular period of time. So as you close out the golden age of the medieval period and you begin to see the decline of the church in terms of its political, social, economic, and even theological power, it's really going to continue on to this point. So even though we're talking about the end of the medieval age, we're not talking about the end of the church that exists in that period of time. It's going to just continue unabated. But there's a number of things that we need to talk about then as to how it got to where it is today, / where it was in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, just before the Reformation. What caused it to get to that place? That's where we're going to go tonight. The church as she was during the Golden Age wanes dramatically from 1300 to 1500. The 200 years between 1300 and 1500 is a dramatic wane of the power and prestige and centrality of the Western Church. So I would argue that the events of this period that we're going to talk about tonight, along with the general drift of the church away from orthodoxy, which has been happening now in our study for quite some time, right, and continues even to today, makes it ripe for a reformation. Makes it ripe for a political reformation and a spiritual or theological reformation. In my opinion, the more important side of that is theological. But it's going to be ripe for a reformation to come. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, which will follow after, will all flow from this period of time. They're all going to come out of the results of what took place in Europe in the 13th to 15th centuries, or I should say 14th to 16th centuries. This is what you're going, the events that we're going to be talking about are going to have those events come out of it. Remember I said, like, for example, last week, the rise of scholasticism, okay? Up until now, in the West, there has been sort of this blind zeal of understanding of Christianity. Blind faith was really the basic understanding of the masses. You didn't have a Bible in your own language. You simply believed what the priest or bishop told you. There was no rationality behind it. It simply is what it is. I would argue that many Catholics are in exactly the same place today. I know, as have been a former one. What we believe is simply what the church tells you to believe, okay? But scholasticism arose in this period of time during the Golden Age to say, wait a minute, we can actually consider the faith on a rational basis. We can think about logically why we believe what we believe. We have the Bible in front of us, yes, but we can think about our natural world and some of the things that are real in our world as to our understanding of things about God. Remember, the scholastics, for example, came up with a number of very interesting arguments for the existence of God. Aquinas and others like him said, look, we don't have to just make an assumption that just because the local parish priest tells us to believe something, we should believe it. We can actually logically and rationally consider these things. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore what the Bible says, but we say, here's what the Bible teaches, and here's how we can logically and rationally understand what the Bible says to be true. In other words, we can analyze, for example, Genesis 3, not just as some mythical story, but as a rational, logical, orderly, structured examination of the creation of the world. And the same is true with so much else. Okay, so it is scholasticism itself, like so much else that's going to take place in this time period, that's going to radically alter the church in the West to usher in the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, etc. Okay? And what we want to talk about tonight in this discussion of the end of the medieval church age are some of the most significant events that occurred during this little window of time and the impact that they had upon Western Christianity. Now, we're even going to talk about some impacts upon Eastern Christianity as well, but these are the events, the big ones, all right? And we're going to break them into three categories. We're going to talk about political events, we're going to talk about natural events, and we're going to talk about religious events. So what I mean by religious are events within the church herself, okay? So let's start with the political events of this particular period of time. Now, the first major thing that happens in this window has begun already in the golden age of the church, but now it accelerates, and it's something called nationalism, the rise of nationalism. All right? Remember that up until now, Europe has pretty much been largely led by a pope and an emperor. Now, when I say an emperor, I'm not talking about the old Roman Empire. I'm talking about the new Holy Roman Empire, the emperors that were established in Europe as a part of the papal authority, men who were given authority to rule over Europe. Remember, the first of them was a man by the name of Charlemagne, who was appointed as emperor in 800 over Europe, and that continues. His little empire, the Carolingian Empire, lasted only a short period of time, but there were other emperors that were established in various places in Europe, and many of them were established by the Pope himself. The system that was established here then is called feudalism. It's the system of nobles and feuds, where nobles own the land and have titles, and then the feuds work for the nobles, and they caretake the land, and the nobles get rich, and the ordinary people get poor. That's how it worked. That's how it was established. But now, feudalism is being replaced by a new socioeconomic system. It's no longer the barter system that's being used. Now is the advent of money, the advent of a monetary system being used throughout the economy in Europe. Wealth moves from land holdings to the actual collection of money. What used to be wealth, of course, was land. The monasteries got rich. Why? Because they held massive swaths of land. But now the economy is changing into a monetary type of environment, and so the exchange of money replaces the barter system, which creates new classes of socioeconomic status. It's no longer a two-status system, a noble and a feud. You now are in part of a class. You can be part of the upper class, the middle class, the lower class, and even to the very poorest of poor. And very much Western civilization has been running on this since these days. You see, for example, the rise of wealthy and centralized bankers and merchants who lent power to localized kings or rulers who are able to raise armies themselves and withstand the power of the nobles and even central emperors of previous generations. So you see a whole change in the way that the economy of Europe goes, which raises up forms of now nationalism. Instead of Europe being one big country, being ruled by a pope and emperors, now it starts to break up into smaller individual little national units. Nationalism becomes the movement away from the feudal system to more centralized governments under a unified border and authority. And it's brought about by the bourgeoisie. It's brought about by people like you and me. Middle class folk. It's the middle class folk. It's the people in the middle, not the poor, not the rich, but the people in the middle. The middle classes that support the efforts of kings to curtail the power of the nobility. The power of money allows ordinary people to demand representation. I want to own something. I want to actually have land to call my own. I don't want to just live under a noble. I want to have my own property. I want to have my own space. And so nationalism begins to come as the middle classes put forward men who are able to, by virtue of them having money coming in from the middle classes, to raise up armies and stand against the emperor and say, oh, no, you don't. This territory is mine. And so you will notice that this becomes little territories and little spaces, and it becomes nations unto themselves. England, France, and the Scandinavian countries are the first developed in the European continent. England, France, and the Scandinavian countries are the first developed. Spain forms near the end of the Middle Ages, Germany later. But nonetheless, they develop individual little nations along the way. Now, why that's important to a discussion of church history is because, if you're paying attention here, you will have noticed that if you now have a continent that's broken up into individual nation states, the Pope in Rome now loses a tremendous amount of power over these individual places. The popes now find themselves in a position of having to actually deal with individual interests in individual places. If the pope leans towards one particular nationalistic group, then other nationalistic groups will consider him an enemy. And so now there's this sense in which the pope is finding himself no longer in a position to be able to dictate power because the bourgeoisie possesses the power. It's not handed to people that he can control easily. It's now running from his hands like water through a sieve. The singularity of interest between a continental monarch and the Pope of Rome is shattered by the localized interest of people, including even their spiritual needs. Where do you think the Church of England came from? It came from a king who decided he would not listen to a pope in Rome tell him what he could do in relationship to his wife that he wanted to divorce so he could marry another. So he told the pope to stick it and developed his own church. We call it today the Church of England. Right? The singularity of interest between a continental monarch and the Pope of Rome is shattered by these localized kinds of things. So you will notice that the entire socio-economic reality of nationalism changes the reality of the Western Church overnight. Okay? We'll see more of this as we go along. A second major event that occurs in this particular period of time occurs between 1337 and 1475. It's called the 100 Years' War. It's a constant series of conflicts between England and France that encompass the rest of Europe in one way or another. The 100 Years' War starts when Edward III of England claims the throne of France, who's held by his cousin Philip VI. The English invaded Scotland, who were supported by the French. King David of Scotland was supported by the French throne, so with the English invasion of Scotland, this led to war. If you want to get a little snippet of this particular period of time, watch the movie Braveheart. Okay? The 100 Years' War was actually not one long war that lasted 100 years. It was 100 years of on and off war, with periods of war followed by periods of peace, treaties established, and then the whole thing breaks down and starts again. The 100 Years' War can best be broken into three phases. There's the initial Edwardian phase from 1337 to 60, as I mentioned, Edward III of England claiming the throne of France. Then you have the Caroline section of the war from 1369 to 1389, and then you have the Lancastrian section from 1415 to 1453. But as England and France are fighting it out over the Channel, they have alliances with other nations and peoples on the European continent. And so this drags most of the rest of Europe into the conflict. There's no way to avoid it. The Bavarians, Navarre, Bohemia, Castile, all dragged into this conflict. In fact, many historians really call this the First World War, or the First European War, because it's really the first major conflict on the continent between the various nation states that have now arisen in this new economy that's come up. I mean, after all, if it's all run by a single emperor and a pope from Rome, then France and Britain should get along. But once France and Britain decide to become two separate nationalistic environments with their own particular focuses and desires, and even the fact that the English think the French territory belongs to them because their king is actually one of the cousins of the king that's sitting on the English throne, all of it becomes a big mess. And that's why it takes 100 years to figure this out, all right? In the end, however, the result was that the House of Valois maintained the French throne, and the two monarchies between Britain and France were separated. It eventually figured itself out, right back where it started, if you will. But in this time was a character known as Joan of Arc. You may be familiar with that name. You may not be familiar with who she was. Joan of Arc lived from 1412 to 1431. She was 19 years old when she died. She was from the village of Domremy in northeastern France. This young woman claimed to have had visions from Saints Catherine and Margaret and the Archangel Michael. In these visions, she claimed, she was ordered to lead the troops of Charles VI's son, the Dauphin, in battle against the English who had claimed the French throne. Now you'll notice this is late in the 100 Years' War, but nonetheless it is a part of that particular time frame. The Dauphin, Charles VI's son, showed signs of madness. Everybody thought he was cuckoo. And the result was, in France itself, various factions which led to civil war between forces loyal to him and forces loyal to the English side of the equation. So not only was the 100 Years' War a war between Britain and France, the 100 Years' War was, at times, a war between the French. I have French ancestry, not particularly proud of this particular moment in the past of my ancestry. This young woman by the name of Joan, after she had these particular visions, had tremendous success in bringing the French Civil War to an end. She actually led the troops of the Dauphin to break the siege of Orleans, which made her then become known as the Maid of Orleans. Now, after breaking the siege, she joined the Dauphin in triumphal march to Reims. Reims was where French kings were typically coronated, and so she went with him there, and he was crowned King of France, with her standing next to him at the altar while he is being coronated. She was, however, captured by the English afterwards. The fight didn't end with the Dauphin being crowned. In fact, that was really only the midpoint of the whole skirmish. She, however, was captured eventually by the British, and she was sold to the Bishop of Beauvais. The bishop at this particular place tried her as a heretic, convinced that because she had heard these visions in French, she must be a heretic. I mean, after all, a British king speaking English would think of anybody speaking French as being a heretic, okay? We're talking about a superstitious time, I get it. So he tried her, found her guilty of that, and had her burned at the stake at the age of 19. Now, Joan of Arc has always been considered a hero in France, but she wasn't sainted until 1920, when Benedict XV sainted her. But she's always, as I said, been a national hero of France. So I bring that story up because I want you to think about that particular period of time. All right, here you have a church that's no longer controlling by power over the nationalistic interests of the continent. It's losing that power rapidly, even to the point where now these nationalistic groups are starting to fall into various forms of civil war. There's certain spiritual individuals like Joan of Arc who are trying to step into this political conflagration, but they're really not going to have much success in the midst of it. So what the 100 Years' War will wind up doing is it helps to shatter the international status of the papacy. At this particular point in time, and we'll come back to this later, the popes themselves are not actually living in Rome. They're living in the south of France at a place called Avignon. They're living there. So the assumption by the English during the 100 Years' War is that the Pope was their enemy because he's living in France and because the papacy has given so much of its resources and so much of its deference to the French kings. The assumption by the English is that the papacy has actually become an enemy to itself, which is part of the reason why you get what you get when you get the Church of England. So what you have is a very weakened power of the Bishop of Rome, and allegiances to him are often forged by nationalistic desires rather than by spiritual claims. Okay, now I want you to notice this, because this is key to understanding where the church in the West is going to go. You have these two main kinds of things happening in Europe. You have the split of the continent into nations, and you have a long war that encompasses this period of time after the golden age of the church. But let's fast forward to one more event that takes place in 1453. At the end of this period of time, as we're approaching now the days of the Reformation. I had said in a lesson before that the popes in the West had attempted to reconcile with the patriarchs of the East, and the Fourth Crusade had actually sent a crusade to try to recapture Constantinople and bring it back under Latin rule, which actually occurred. There was something called Latin rule of the Eastern Church for a brief period of time in the 13th and 14th centuries. But it ended because the West was too weak to keep it up. But the reality was that the empire in the the empire in the East, headquartered at Constantinople, was weak, very weak. It consisted at this point only of the city itself and the surrounding land around the city. So the entirety of the Eastern Empire, which at one time covered all of the eastern side of the Mediterranean. You remember going from Istanbul through Asia Minor, down into Syria and Damascus, through Palestine, around through Egypt, and across the northern scope of Africa, all the way to Carthage, and even to the Straits of Gibraltar at the other end of the continent. All of that territory that it covered has been pushed back to basically the city of Constantinople. The Muslim invasions have pushed it back first, and then just the general decline of the empire over time. What is left of the old Roman Empire in the east has reached the point where it's nothing more than one city. The Byzantine emperors, what was left of them, appealed to the West for help, but, as I said before, the popes are weakened by nationalism. They don't have the strength any longer in the nationalistic fervor of the West to come to the aid of the East at this particular point. In fact, when the popes in the West demand that their help be based on ecclesiastical reconciliation, many of the patriarchs around Constantinople, rejected the call and said, forget it. And so the East, I'm dyslexic. The East gets messed up. They don't have any support from the West, and so they're left helpless. So here come the Turks. The Muslims have been fighting amongst themselves for quite some time, but the Turks break out at this particular point, and the Turkish Sultan Muhammad II begins a siege of the city of Constantinople on April the 7th, 1453. Inside the city, a solemn service is held in the Hagia Sophia on May the 28th, praying to the Lord for the city to be spared. But the very next day, the Sultan's forces breach the walls of Constantinople and the city falls. Emperor Palaeologus, I guess you would pronounce it, dies in the battle, and the city itself is sacked for 3 days. The Sultan gives permission for the forces to come in and take whatever they can for 3 straight days. Millions are killed. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque almost immediately by the Turkish Sultan. The Turkish government converted it to a museum in the early 20th century, and I had the opportunity to visit it. We saw pictures of it when I was there. But over the last, I think 3 years ago, the Turkish government rescinded its authority as a museum, turned it back into a mosque. So you can't visit it as other than a mosque. The city, of course, is lost. Constantinople is gone, and now the city is renamed. And today we know it as Istanbul. Now, the Eastern Church, of course, on that particular side would continue, as it does even to today. Just as the Western Church will continue from these days all the way to today, the Eastern Church will continue, the Orthodox Church will continue all the way to today, but it's no longer under an empire. No longer has an emperor over it to support it. Now you will notice, the reason I bring this incident is because there's a parallel on both sides of the former Roman Empire. The church that was there was under an emperor, held power under that empire, but now on both sides, that authority and power has evaporated. The Western Church no longer has an emperor over the nationalistic interest being run by the Pope, and the patriarchs of the East are no longer being controlled and protected by an emperor. On both sides, at this particular point, in 1453, the old Roman Empire is gone, and the original empires that struck out after the original Roman Empire fell are also now gone. Turkey becomes a nation after this. So what you see is these political events are driving Christendom into the corner. All right? Those are the political events that occur. But there's a natural event that occurs in this period of time as well that will have deep impact upon the life of Christianity at this time. And it occurs in 1347 to 1350. And it's called the Black Plague. Strikes the European continent. Today we call it the bubonic plague, sometimes called the Black Plague, same thing. It is a disease that broke loose around the Black Sea. It is often attributed to rats, but rats are only the carriers. The actual disease is the fleas on the rats that carry this particular disease. It started in the Black Sea. As you know, that's close to Italy, so it moved its way out of Italy and into northern Europe and swept the entire continent between 1348 and 1350. For 3 years, it ravaged the continent. Those who were infected first came down with a fever, and then they experienced loss of balance, which implied some sort of inner ear issue. Then they experienced swollen lymph nodes and dementia. And if you had these symptoms, you were dead by the 5th day. There was no vaccine, there was no prophylactics, there was no hospitalization that could solve this issue. In the midst of the 14th century, if you got it, you died. Estimates put the dead at up to 1/3 of the population of Europe. About 1/3 population. Better estimates now put the toll somewhere between 30% and 40% of the entire population of Europe. Now, let me put that into perspective for you. if I accept the numbers given on the COVID-19 death rate in the United States, and I don't, but if I accepted the 600,000 number that is given to us, that represents 0.2% of the American population. Not 2%, 0.2% of the population. 0.2% of the population has died. Think about that in comparison to 30 to 40% of the population. If 30% of the American population died today, almost 100 million would be dead. So if the bubonic plague were to strike, if the real pandemic were to occur, an editorial comment, if a real pandemic were to occur, we would have lost 100 million people in the United States. You think the economic toll was bad with 600,000 dying? Imagine what it would be like if 100 million perished in this country. So I bring that up because such a thing is going to have effect on people spiritually speaking. It had a minor effect upon Americans spiritually speaking, but hardly anywhere near the kind of effect that happened here. Now, by the way, the plague did abate after those first 3 years, but it reappeared. It kept outbreaking about every 10 to 12 years. And what's ironical about this plague is that in its recurrences, it killed the young, not the old. And the reason why, this should have been a lesson for America, the reason why is because the old had developed immunity to it. If they had survived the first round, they survived because they developed an immunity to it. So when it reoccurred, they would survive it because they had a natural immunity to it. The young who did not have a natural immunity to it were the ones most often likely to perish. Now that has also an effect. Death in that day was all around you. People lived in a time when death was visible, always present. We don't live in such a day. Today we hustle the dead off to the funeral home and we neatly bury them away and we don't even talk about death. We have a lot of death in our culture, but we don't view it. We don't see it in our homes. We don't watch it occurring in our streets every day. But that's what it was here. In fact, death became personified in this particular period of time. Death became personal. It became a person, a thing. And when these reoccurrences of death were occurring as the bubonic plague would come back around again for another attack, death would be personified. And people living in this spiritually pagan time, or pagan's probably not the right word, maybe let's call it a spiritually illiterate time, where they don't have access to Scripture and much of faith is blind faith, of what you're simply told to believe. They have no protection spiritually against what's going on and what they see happening in the streets around them. And it changes the way people start thinking spiritually, especially in Christianity. What rises up in this particular time is massive superstition, massive mysticism. We start to see Christians now embracing the idea of protecting themselves by making pilgrimages, going to places where they could view the tombs of the former saints of the past in the hope that that would in some way protect them from death that's about to come again into our lives. The veneration of relics becomes a significant part of that. People going and finding the bones of a former saint and bringing them into their homes and putting them in little shrines in their homes because it will protect them. The superstition and the mysticism that rises up. It rises up, my friends, because of the massive spiritual illiteracy of the times. Because the people don't have the Bible in their own language. They only know what the local priest or bishop has told them. And even they are subject to the superstitions of the time because, look, the bishops are men just like everyone else. And their wives and their children died in the bubonic plague. And they sometimes died in the bubonic plague. Guess what happens? You have a massive roiling of spirituality taking place at this particular period of time. Many, remember I said earlier, many have said that the Dark Ages goes all the way through this period because this is a very dark age in the time of the church. The golden age of the church in the West is followed by an extremely dark period of time. Now, it's very short, so I don't put the whole period of time to be the Dark Ages. There's tremendous things that happened during the Golden Age. I gave you 2 whole lessons on that because I think it's a significant period of time ushering in some things. But this darkness is once again, like nationalism, like war before, what's it going to do? It's going to make the church ripe for a reformation. It's this sort of thing that's coming in and changing the way people are thinking about things spiritually that it's going to make it ripe for a reformation. But it's also going to solidify that mysticism. Perry and I could tell you some stories that'll make your hair curl about the kinds of things that you must believe if you are a Catholic. Most of you have been protected from that, praise God. But the reality is there's a whole lot of mysticism in Catholicism that traces itself all the way back to these days. Look, there are Catholics today making pilgrimages to holy sites and shrines in order to see things, in order to have some sort of spiritual sustenance to them. I mean, we even have a grotto here in Alabama, don't we? Isn't there one up north with the EWTN folks? The grotto of, what's it called? Anyways, people go there, right? People go to Lourdes. People go to Fatima. What do they go there for? Well, maybe I'll see a vision of Mary that will give me new hope of some sort in some way. Joan of Arc is classic of this time period. She was a mystic. She's a classic of this particular time period. You'll notice where Christianity is going. The illiteracy of the average person is changing the church herself in terms of what she believes and why she believes it. All right, so we've talked about political events, natural. Let's talk about some of the religious events. All right, let's talk about some things going on inside the church. Now, I could spend 4 hours here on this, but I'm not going to. Some of you are going, oh man. No, we're not. I want to just very briefly talk to you about 2 things that occur in the West in terms of the church's structure that might give you some insight into what else is happening here. Okay. The first is something called the Babylonian captivity of the church, which occurred between 1309 and 1377. A twisting series of events, and when I say twisting series of events, I mean that Justos Gonzalez in his book has 20 pages on this, okay? So I'm just going to summarize it as a twisting series of events by which the popes become tools of the French monarchy and French policy and move their residence to Avignon in the south of France. Okay? Between 1309 and 1377, the popes didn't live in Rome. They lived in Avignon. They lived in the south of France because they were puppets of the French government. Now, one could argue that they were also having tremendous influence over the French government at that particular point. I mean, that's a hand-in-glove kind of situation, okay? The 100 Years' War is going on during this period of time. So the popes are living in France in this particular period of time because of these series of events. Now, the Babylonian captivity, it's called the Babylonian captivity because those who are pure Catholics look at it as a captivity, right? Our popes went off to live in France instead of living in Rome because Rome is where the seat of Peter is, and so being off away is being off in Babylon. Okay, that's why they call it the Babylonian captivity, because they're not in Rome anymore. Okay, I don't really think of it as a captivity at all because they went there of their own volition. Okay, they wanted to be there. They wanted to be a part of French French life and French monarchy. Now, Gregory XI did return the papacy to Rome in 1377. He did so at the urging of St. Catherine of Siena, who was another mystic. She was a woman of her time. But she managed to convince the Pope to move back to Rome in 1377. Okay, so for a brief time in the history of the Western Church, about 70 years or so, the Church found its ecclesiastical head living not in Rome, but in France. Now, we'll put that together with another event that takes place in 1378, 1 year later. And this is what we call the Great Western Schism of the Western Church. Now, the Great Schism of the Western Church, the Great Western Schism. We'll differentiate that from the Great Schism between the East and the West that occurred back in 1054 when the two churches, East and West, separated. Okay, that's the Great Schism. This is the Great Western Schism. All right, this is happening in the Western Church. It goes like this. Just after Gregory XI returned to Rome and then died, it was necessary at that point to elect a new pope. Problem. Some of the cardinals, no, most of the cardinals, who would elect the pope were French. And the fear was, amongst many, particularly the followers of St. Catherine, that these French popes would once again elect these French cardinals would once again elect a French pope, and guess where he would want to go live? Back in France, in Avignon. So it produced a problem. The cardinals then had to deal with this. So they elected a man by the name of, or a man who became Urban VI. Urban, however, in trying to convert, if you will, that's not the right word, but somehow change the College of Cardinals so that it was mostly Italian, he did what today we would call a court packing. He decided to try to just fill up the College of Cardinals with Italian popes, or Italian cardinals, in the hope that in the future popes elected would be elected by the Italians rather than by the French. Okay. Well, in his attempts to do that Reformation, they thought he had gone mad. And so they stepped aside, the cardinals that is, stepped aside and decided, you know what? This guy's not a legitimate pope. Now, what's ironical about that is the same group of men who stood at his coronation and said, that's the guy. But now all of a sudden they've decided, nah, not so much. So they elect another man who takes the name Clement VII. So the same group of cardinals that had coronated Urban now elect Clement into the office of pope. Clement moves to Avignon. Urban stays in Rome. What do you think is going to happen when you have two popes? Well, you're going to have different nations picking sides, right? France and Scotland recognize Clement in Avignon. England and others recognize Urban in Rome. It becomes a gigantic mess. In fact, there was even a period of time during this time when there was a third pope elected and put in place. But that's a whole other story, and I'll leave that for another time. This dual papacy and its conciliation, which we'll talk about in a future lesson, would sow the seeds of the Reformation. Rome, by the way, now accepts as legitimate only the line of Urban, not the line of Clement. They consider Clement to be an anti-pope. So if you ever get lists from the Catholic Church of the popes, you will see that they go through the Roman popes and then somehow manage to skirt over the Babylonian captivity into a pope before that. If you get those lists, they're all a fraud, by the way, because they all go back to Peter and no. Those of us who've studied history know it ain't the case. Okay. Now, again, some religious events. You have the papacy itself actually finding itself outside of Rome and then being divided between men who mutually excommunicate each other and then wind up getting supported by different nationalistic groups and so forth. Okay. So you'll notice that during this period of time you have a series of events that take place. And they're all really having a significant impact upon the church. You have political events where you have a whole new way of thinking going on in the continent in terms of allegiance of average folks to kings, and you have nationalisms, and you start to see the rise of borders and so forth and so on. Then the whole continent breaks out into a war that lasts more than 100 years. We call it the 100 Years' War, but it's really the First World War, in which you have this straining of the relationships between all these different nations, and the Pope is caught in the middle between all of it. And then, of course, you have the fall of Constantinople in the east, which leads to this place where you have two churches, two separate Christian churches, one in the west and one in the east, that have lost virtually all of their political power. It's gone, almost overnight. Add to that, then, a plague that comes in the midst of that, which forces the common, ordinary, illiterate Christian on either side of the equation. This was mostly in Europe. It didn't really affect the East. But the fact is that you have this massive uptick in mysticism and superstition and these other things affecting and controlling and changing the way that the average Christian, quote unquote, thinks at the time. And then you stir into all of that the intramural squabbles of the popes themselves as they're trying to figure out who's really in charge and where to live and who's excommunicating who and so forth. Guess what you have at the end of it? You have a church in the West that's virtually dead. That's what you have. Which leads to the question. I'll end it with a question. Let's think about it like this. Are the events of this period, okay, nationalism, 100 Years' War, the plague, the Babylonian captivity, right, the Great Western Schism, all right, all these events, are the events of this period all a part of the sovereign plan of God to move the church in a different direction? Of course they are. That's exactly what they are. The sovereign hand of God working through massive events taking place, and unfortunately, even the sovereign decree of God causing 30 to 40% of the population to die in a plague in the midst of it, causing the church herself to wane in terms of its power being wrested from the hands of these men, who then turn to fighting each other over who's in charge and whose policies they're going to fall under and so forth. Is this part of the sovereign plan of God to move the church in a different direction? Let me ask it in a different way. What has the church become at this point? What's left of the church? Now, when I mean the church, I mean that which the apostles originally created and established and went out into the world and preached and taught and gave their lives for. What's left of that? What's become of it? It's gone. It's fractured. It's not just fractured. You might argue that it's just plain dead at this point. And what might God be doing to the world around it to sow the seeds of new growth out of the old dead stump? What happens when you cut down a tree? It has a tendency to want to sprout again, doesn't it? You want an example of that, by the way? I'll give you one. Right out here, just as you go out this driveway, we cut down that, just after Sally, we cut down that big tree that's out there. As you drive by tonight, notice the sprout sticking out of the top of it. It's coming back to life. It is going to take over those power lines. I want them, it says. Is this not really a dead stump that's just primed and ready for a shoot to come forth from it? The answer to this question is that the church has become a political engine that has lost its power spiritually. And even that political power has so dramatically waned due to its own internal failures that it is nothing but a shell of its former self. That's all it is. Yes, there's still a bishop of Rome. And yes, there are still bishops leading masses and praying for the dead and all the other things that they do as Catholics around the continent. I almost said empire. Empire's gone. So there's still Christianity, quote unquote, but what is it as Christianity? What's the average person living in the 14th century thinking about in terms of his Christian faith? He doesn't have a Bible in his lap, does he? Doesn't have a Bible in his lap. He probably doesn't know Latin even if he had a Bible in his lap, right? The priest or bishop is leading the Mass in Latin, which he doesn't understand, but he goes through the motions because, well, that's what you're supposed to do as a Christian. His understanding of the Christian faith is really nothing more than, well, you know, I was born a Christian, quote unquote. My parents had me baptized in the local parish. I've lived all my life as a Christian, as part of this Christian world in which I live, but I really don't understand what that means. I certainly don't understand all of the totality of justification by faith alone or any of these kinds of things. I've never heard the topics even mentioned. Preaching at this point, by the way, is all but gone in the church. And what do you have left of Christianity at this point? Even the East is not any better. I mean, the East continues to hold on to its orthodoxy going back a few hundred years, even 1,000 years, back to the Great Schism and even before. But it's slowly, where do people naturally have a tendency to go? They don't go towards orthodoxy, they go away from it. The natural tendency is not for us to go towards orthodoxy, it's to go away from it. So the East is drifting as its masses do the same. So there's nothing. Where's the gospel in all of this? Where's the message of Christ in all of this? What are people clinging to for their eternal state? What are people clinging to for their eternal state? Yes, I would agree with the historians who call this the Dark Ages, because, yeah, as far as the spiritual light of the gospel is concerned, it is all but flickered out at this point. You and I live in a very different age, and it's very hard for us to understand that particular age. It really is. I know there's been a lot of dramatic attempts to try to help us to understand that particular time frame. I gave you Braveheart as an example, to try to understand the thinking of people in terms of what it means to be Christian and so forth. But I don't think any of us can really grasp the vacuum of the gospel that has occurred in this particular period of time. We have sunk, Christianity itself has sunk here. But I would argue that that's on purpose, that God has driven the church into the ground, taken away its power, forced its people into this place in order to then bring a new shoot from the stump, which is what the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment are going to do. They're going to bring light into this particular period of time. Not all of it is going to be good, but the reality is that this is prime now. So the end of the medieval age is the end of that time in which the Christian church in the West found herself having such authority and control over people's lives. But in the process of doing so, for the last 400 years or so, the church has drifted up politically and socially, but down theologically, to the point now where once the church's head is lopped off in the sense that its political power is lost, the average person has nothing to hold on to. Nothing. And so, the end of the medieval period, the end of the medieval church age, is the end of the view of the church where she is both a political and spiritual engine or power. Because at this point, she's neither. She's neither. And in terms of her financial realities, there are still very many rich men in the church, but they are not interested in what matters. So I hope you see where this has led us. See? The medieval church had a period of time when there was a desire for reformation, there was a desire for a sense of being restored. The scholastics were thinking, but it was short-lived, very short-lived, because the fundamentals of the Christian faith were missing, and it became easy for the church to collapse. Any questions that you'd like to ask? What an upbeat lesson that was, wasn't it? Now, by the way, in case you haven't figured it out, the parallels between this particular period of time and the modern church are unmistakable. And it's only been 500 years. Which should, by the way, give us a strong impetus to say, well, let's make sure we know what we believe and why we believe it, and let's not fall into the trap of the illiteracy of that particular period of time, right? I mean, learn from history by not repeating it,